The sky over the old industrial yard held that washed-out gray only Saturdays in late autumn seemed to produce, a light that did not flatter anyone. The air smelled of cold metal and engine oil that had soaked too long into concrete. The yard belonged to a decommissioned auxiliary facility once tied to Whitmore Dynamics, and after several seasons of quiet abandonment, it had finally been cleared for liquidation. Men in heavy boots kicked through crates, a forklift complained somewhere past the fence, and an old dog watched everything from a patch of sun. Flynn Mercer had not come to dream. He had come for parts. He was a single father, 29 years old, a mechanic who kept his own narrow workshop behind a rented house on the quieter edge of town, and every dollar in his pocket already had a name written on it. The rent had a name. The school lunch account had a name. The last hospital bill from his late wife had a name too, and that name was still loud. Beside him, half a step behind, walked his son. Leo was 6, a quiet child with solemn brown eyes and the kind of patient posture that does not belong to most boys his age. In his left hand he carried a little toy car, the paint rubbed to bare metal in places, the tires worn smooth. It had belonged to his mother. He did not say so out loud anymore, but he held it the way other children held their mother's hands. Flynn worked the rows without hurry. He picked over a set of brake calipers, tested the weight of a steering column, set down a cracked distributor cap. He was looking for a bracket that would not fail on the minivan waiting back at the shop, and perhaps a clean bearing or two. He did not have the luxury of curiosity. And yet, in the deepest row of the yard, where the light fell sideways through a ribbed metal roof, something caught him. Under a split tarp sat a small car. Not a child's pedal cart, not a commercial toy, and not quite any model he could name. Its body was riddled with rust, its glass cracked in a lace pattern across the windshield, its tires flat as pancakes. By every ordinary measure, it was scrap. But Flynn did not move. What held him was not the ruin. It was the proportion. The way the roofline dropped into the rear quarter. The measured gap between the axles. The unbroken sweep of the fender that refused to meet the door in a careless line. Someone had thought about this shape. Someone had held it in their hands long before rust ever touched it. From behind him came the soft voice of his son. "Dad," Leo said. "It looks like somebody used to love it." Before Flynn could answer, the yard shifted. Feet moved aside. An unfamiliar current of attention ran through the space. Audrey Whitmore had arrived. She stepped into the aisle with a lawyer at her left and an assistant at her right, walking the way people walk when they have never been interrupted. She was 27 years old and already the chief executive of Whitmore Dynamics. Her cream-colored dress followed the line of her figure with the neat confidence of expensive cloth. Her long hair, loose at her shoulders, shifted with every step. Among the suited crates and oil-darkened concrete, she glowed in a way that seemed almost rude. She had come to approve a final inventory list. She had not come to find anything. George Calloway, the yard owner, recognized Flynn from before, recognized the look of a man making a small stand, and called out across the aisle that the little car would go for $300 flat, as is, because by Monday afternoon, it was headed to the crusher. Flynn held still for a long moment. $300 for him was a pair of shoes Leo would have grown into by spring. It was not a sum he could afford to lose. He looked at the rusted car. Then he looked at his son, who was still holding the old toy he refused to set down anywhere. Then he reached for his wallet. A low laugh from behind them turned every head. Audrey had paused mid-step, her mouth tightening into the amused half-smile of a person who had spent her life being correct. She did not mean to wound. She meant to dismiss. And so, in a voice that carried well enough to land, she said, so that even the little boy beside the man could hear her plainly, "You just paid $300 to haul home a pile of rust." That is an expensive way to teach a child the wrong lesson. Something in the air thinned. Men at the neighboring row turned slightly, then decided it was not their business. Leo, 6 years old and careful, looked down at the small toy in his hand. Flynn said nothing. He did not lift his eyes to meet hers. He did not argue. He simply bent down, straightened the zipper of his son's jacket, stepped Leo closer to his hip, and returned to tying the small car onto the trailer with a length of weathered strap. It was the silence that made the insult heavier. If he had raised his voice, the moment would have closed into a common argument and ended there. He did not give her that. Audrey, for her part, did not think of it again until much later. For her, it had been a small sentence in a busy morning. And Flynn drove home with a rusted little car trembling on the trailer behind him, like a forgotten story finally being lifted out of its hiding place. The house where Flynn and Leo lived was not the kind of house anyone photographed. It sat at the dead end of a narrow street, where the street lamps hummed too loudly in summer, and the gutters took on a life of their own in fall. But the inside was clean, the floors swept, the dishes dried and stacked in the same order every evening. A calendar on the refrigerator carried Leo's school notes in Flynn's square, steady handwriting. A second sheet beside it listed bills by due date, a quiet army Flynn met one by one. Flynn's wife had died 2 winters earlier. She had not died dramatically. She had died the way most people actually go, with a slow withdrawal, too many appointments, too many small losses spread over too many months, and then a quietness that still caught Flynn by surprise sometimes. What she had left him was the emptiness, the bills, and a very small boy who understood grown-up feelings with an instinct no one had taught him. That evening, Flynn made dinner the way he always did. Nothing fancy, nothing rushed. He reheated a pan of chicken and rice from the night before and cut an apple into thin crescents, because Leo had once said apples tasted better sliced that way. He asked about school. Leo answered in the small, careful sentences of a child who had learned that conversation was a thing to be treasured and not spent too fast. But Flynn lingered longer than usual in front of the sink that night. $300. He added the number up again out of habit, weighed it against what he already owed. The math did not improve. From the hallway, Leo's small voice reached him. "Are you sad because the lady laughed?" Flynn dried his hands slowly before turning around. He crouched down to his son's level. "Not everybody sees things the same way, buddy," he said. "That is not always about you." Leo considered that carefully, the way he considered most things. "But you still think the car is special," he said. "Right?" Flynn was quiet for a moment. "I think someone put a lot of thought into it," he said finally. "That is worth looking at." Leo nodded, satisfied, and went to brush his teeth. Later, after the boy was asleep and the house had settled into its nighttime silence, Flynn walked out to the garage and turned on the single work lamp above the bench. Its yellow light fell across the rusted little car with the softness of an old theater spotlight finding a forgotten actor at the back of the stage. For the first time, Flynn set his hand on the hood the way a person greets a stranger whose name they have not yet learned. He did not rush in. Flynn had seen too many men rip a project apart in excitement and ruin what they were trying to understand. Instead, he began with the slow grammar of a real mechanic. He walked around the car 3 times. He measured the gap between the doors and the fenders with a pair of calipers. He laid a straight edge against the roof and watched where it lifted. He ran a cloth along the body until his palm could feel the seams where the shape changed. The first oddity was the weight. Flynn rocked the chassis gently with both hands and felt how lightly it answered him. A car built as a commercial toy would have been made from something cheap and dense. This little body had been made from an alloy he could not yet name, something clearly chosen with purpose. The second oddity was the steering. When he crawled underneath with a work light, he found a miniaturized geometry that no serious engineer wastes on a novelty. The tie rod ends had been machined, not molded. There were alignment witness marks near the knuckles that only an assembly line with real tolerances would have bothered to stamp. The third oddity was the logo. Beneath layers of rust and the flaked remains of a clear coat, Flynn found a scar. It was not corrosion. It was the faint outline of a symbol that had been ground off with deliberate patience. Somebody, years ago, had not wanted this car to be identified. The fourth oddity was the smallest and the most interesting. Inside what had once been a shallow electrical bay, there was a tiny metal plate, hammered in place and then almost forgotten. Flynn wiped the grime away with the edge of his thumb and held the work lamp close. 2 short lines were engraved into the surface. Sparrow. The first line read. H period, H period. The second line read. Flynn stared at it for a long time. The next morning he called Carter Bennett, the closest thing he had to a friend, a man who owned a modest garage 2 towns over and had never been wrong about an engine in 20 years. Carter came around 10, walked once around the little car, and made the face he usually reserved for hands he was not willing to play. He slid under the chassis on a creeper and stayed there longer than Flynn expected. When he came back up, there was grease on his forearms and something careful in his eyes. "Flynn," Carter said, "this was not hobby work. Somebody built this as a prototype." Flynn nodded. "I know." Carter wiped his hands. "What are you going to do with it?" "I am going to understand it," Flynn said, "before I decide anything else." Leo came into the garage then, carrying his mother's old toy in the same steady hand he always used. He climbed up onto an overturned crate and sat with his ankles crossed, watching his father the way some children watch fireworks. "Are you going to fix it?" he asked. "Not yet," Flynn said. "I am going to listen to it first." Over the next 2 evenings, Flynn and Carter put the question of the name through every quiet channel they had. Old engineering forums, digitized industry newsletters, lapsed patent filings. The work was not cinematic. It was phone calls that did not return, laptops that hummed through the night, cups of coffee that went cold between paragraphs. A picture began to form, faintly. More than 15 years earlier, in the early, less corporate years of Whitmore Dynamics, there had been a small research branch devoted to ultralight chassis design for high-performance electric vehicles. The branch had been bold on paper, obsessive in practice, and too far ahead of what the market was ready to buy. It vanished from public records after a fire at a satellite workshop and a painful internal restructuring that nobody in the press ever fully explained. What little survived kept repeating one phrase about the founder himself, that he had been the sort of engineer determined, as one interviewer put it, to shrink an entire philosophy into something a person could hold in their hands. His name had been Henry Whitmore. Flynn sat back in the creaking chair in the corner of the garage and stared at the photograph of the small metal plate on his screen. H period, H period. He turned the letters over in his mouth. Henry H. Whitmore. It was not an uncommon way for an engineer of that generation to sign internal drawings, a quiet ghost of the longer name he had been born under. Somewhere across the same city, in an office with more windows than walls, Audrey Whitmore was sitting at the head of a long meeting table, reviewing figures for a closing investment round that would decide much of her next year. She had worked, privately, harder than anyone on that board to reach her chair. She had trained herself into a version of herself that nobody could accuse of being inexperienced, soft, or unserious. She did not answer compliments. She answered results. When her assistant came to the door with a cautious expression, Audrey did not look up right away. "There is a man," the assistant said, "who bought a small rusted car last Saturday at the Whitmore liquidation yard. He is asking questions about an old branch called Project Sparrow." Audrey's pen stopped moving. She did not lift her eyes for a full breath. She was already preparing, inwardly, the tone she would use to have it dismissed. Grifters came out of the woodwork around any company with history. People attached themselves to legends the way barnacles attach themselves to ships. But the word sparrow sat in the air between them and refused to leave. When she had been a very small girl, long before she had become the woman in the cream-colored dress at the liquidation yard, her father had sometimes, on rare Sundays, picked her up into his arms and called her that same word. Little Sparrow. She had not heard it spoken out loud in so many years that she had half convinced herself she had imagined it, To the world, Henry Whitmore was a legend of industry. To her, he had been a man who was too often elsewhere, and then, one spring, not anywhere at all. "Find out where this man works," Audrey said. "I will go myself." It was late afternoon when a sleek black sedan rolled up to the curb outside Flynn's garage. Audrey stepped out alone. She wore a fitted champagne-colored dress cut in the same professional silhouette her wardrobe favored, her hair loose and catching the last of the sun, her heels wildly wrong for a driveway that still had gravel in the corners. She did not seem to notice. She did not seem to care. Flynn was on his back under the car when she arrived, and he took his time coming out. He did not hurry to meet her. He did not straighten his collar. He simply slid out on the creeper, stood up, wiped his hands on a shop rag, and waited for her to say the first word. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "I have been told you may have something of interest to my company." He nodded once. "I might." She crossed her arms lightly. "I am prepared to offer you $3,000 for the small car," she said. "As is. No inspection required." "I will send someone with a trailer this evening." Flynn looked at her for a long moment. It was 10 times what he had paid. It was a great deal of money for a man who sorted bills by due date. He did not rush to answer. He seldom did. "No," he said. Audrey's eyebrow lifted just slightly. "Then 4,000. "It is not about the price," Flynn said. "I do not know yet what this car is. If it is what I think it might be, then selling it right now like this would be the wrong thing to do." "The wrong thing for whom?" "For the person who built it." The sentence landed somewhere she had not been expecting. She steadied. "And what do you think you are holding?" "I do not know yet," Flynn said. "But I know it was not thrown together. Whoever made this cared about it." Audrey took a slow, deliberate breath, the kind executives take when they are reminding themselves not to answer too soon. She walked past him into the garage. Inside, the work lamp was on, and on the clean bench Flynn had laid out the scraped logo, the small engraved plate, a handful of photographs of the alloy frame, and a page of his own careful notes. Everything was arranged the way a museum would arrange evidence. Nothing was arranged the way a man who wanted to raise a price would arrange anything. She looked at the plate first. Her composure did not crack. It did, however, pause. At that moment, a small figure appeared in the side doorway, the last sunlight falling across his shoulder. Leo was holding his mother's old toy car in his right hand and a peeled apple slice in his left. He looked at Audrey without fear, without accusation, simply with the plain observance of children who have no reason yet to lie about what they see. "If the car used to belong to someone who mattered to you," Leo said softly, "how come you didn't know it?" Audrey did not answer. For the first time since she had walked in, she was not a chief executive. She was a woman who had just been asked a question she had been avoiding her entire adult life. She left a few minutes later without making another offer. But before she did, she turned, once, at the edge of the garage, and looked at the little car again. Flynn worked through the next night with Carter. They went at the dashboard inch by inch, pulling covers, unscrewing brackets that had fused in place. Behind one oddly stubborn panel, the one neither of them had been able to move for 2 days, they found the reason for its stubbornness. It had not been installed as trim. It had been installed as a lid. Beneath it lay a shallow compartment, lined with a soft, dust-stained felt. Inside were 3 things. A storage drive of the kind most people had not used in more than a decade. A small notebook, wrapped in a layer of moisture-resistant cloth. And a photograph, creased at one corner, its colors faded into that particular autumn palette that old family pictures seemed to share. The photograph stopped them first. In it, a little girl of about 7 years old stood beside a workbench, her hand resting on a half-finished model of the same small car they were now rebuilding. Her hair was long and darker than it would later be. Her smile was small, the shy, uncertain smile of a child who had not been sure if she was allowed to be there. Behind her, out of focus, was a tall man whose hand rested lightly on her shoulder. "Flynn," Carter said, and his voice had lost some of its usual roughness. "That girl looks an awful lot like the woman who came to your garage." It took most of another evening to read the storage drive. Carter had a friend who still kept a computer old enough to speak to the thing, and together they coaxed a partial recovery. Most of the files were gone. One was not. A short audio file. Flynn called Audrey the next morning. She came alone this time, without the sedan, in a simpler gray coat that she might have worn on an ordinary Saturday. Leo had been sent next door for the hour. The garage was clean and still. Flynn did not explain. He only placed a small speaker on the bench and pressed play. The voice filled the space. "If you are listening to this, my dear, then it probably means I ran out of time before I could finish what I wanted to give you. I kept telling myself I would hand it over on your birthday. Then, on the next one. I was always a better engineer than a father. I am sorry for that. I am sorry for every school play I missed, and for every dinner I spent with a drafting table instead of with you. This little thing, this sparrow, it was supposed to be my way of saying what I never said well out loud. I wanted you to hold something I had made, and understand. I love you, Sparrow. I always did. Even when I was too clumsy to say so." The recording ended. Audrey did not move. She did not cry loudly. She did not cover her face. She stood the way a person stands when they are trying to keep the walls of themselves from collapsing in full view of a stranger. Her hands, at her sides, went white at the knuckles where she pressed them against the edge of the bench. She stared at the speaker long after it had gone silent. Flynn did not approach her. He did not speak. He only reached over, quietly, and turned the speaker off, so that whatever she needed to feel would not have an audience. "After a long while," she said, without looking at him, "he used to call me that." Flynn nodded, although she could not see him. "He never finished it," she said. The sentence seemed to surprise her as she said it. "No," Flynn said. "But he did build it. That has to count for something." She left not long after. She did not make a new offer for the car. She did not need to. The little car, in a single afternoon, had stopped being a piece of property, and had quietly become a part of her that she did not yet know how to hold. Audrey did not sleep that night. She sat in her tall, beautiful apartment, with the lights turned low, and let the recording run over and over in her mind. Not the words. The voice. The specific weight of her father's voice, older in it than she remembered, more tired. She had spent so many years being angry at him for being absent that she had forgotten the simpler, harder fact underneath. He had been absent. He had also been trying. Those two things had been allowed to live in the same man, and she had not let them. She remembered unwillingly a school recital when she was 8. She had scanned the rows of parents for her father's face, and not found it. She had convinced herself that night that he did not care. She had carried that conviction like a badge ever since. She also remembered a Sunday afternoon when he had come home covered in grease, and asked her to sit beside him at a drafting table, and had called her his little sparrow, and had let her choose between 2 shades of paint for something she had not understood. She had chosen the darker one. He had laughed. She had forgotten the moment until now. What pierced her now was not the loss of the father. It was the fact that she had, in a busy moment on a gray morning, stood in a liquidation yard and laughed at the only thing he had ever finished making for her. And she had done it in front of a 6-year-old boy who had looked down at his own small toy and said nothing. She did not think she could live with that without doing something. In another part of the city, Flynn went about his life. He opened the garage in the morning. He made Leo's breakfast. He kept cleaning the rusted little car, panel by panel, coat by coat. He did not wait by the phone for Audrey. He did not expect her to change. He was not that kind of man. But he did notice that Leo, who noticed everything, had begun to watch his father more carefully. "Is she sad about the car, or about the person who made it?" Leo asked at dinner. Flynn thought for a long moment. Maybe both, he said. Word about Project Sparrow, of course, did not stay quiet. In the narrow, gossiping world of collectors and private industry, a lost prototype tied to a founder of Henry Whitmore's stature was not the kind of story that could be kept in a garage for long. By the end of the week, discreet inquiries were arriving at the Whitmore Dynamics front desk, and less discreet inquiries were arriving at Flynn's shop. One private collector made an opening bid of $100,000. A Heritage Industrial Fund hinted at a valuation in the millions if a full authentication could be assembled. The Whitmore Dynamics board responded the way boards respond. They saw brand opportunity, not family story. They saw share price, not a father's apology. They saw a campaign arc, not a little girl in a faded photograph. Within a day, a memo had been drafted, a strategy meeting had been calendared, and a set of talking points had been prepared for whoever would eventually stand at a podium and tell the world a version of the truth. Audrey read the memo in her office. She read it twice. Then she set it down on her desk, very slowly, and looked out of the window at the skyline her father had helped build. She did not argue with the memo immediately. She was still, in many ways, her father's daughter, which meant she understood fiduciary responsibility, cold quarterly calendars, and the pressure of investors who had not come to a meeting to be moved. She also understood now, something she had refused to understand before. Some things a family made were not for sale. She called the board together for a formal review before she did anything she would regret. On the same morning, Flynn received a call from Whitmore Dynamics. A meeting was being arranged. His presence was requested. His little car was the reason for the request. Carter, when he heard, leaned back against the tool bench with both hands on his hips and looked at Flynn for a long, slow moment. "You know what that room is going to look like," Carter said. "I know. You are still going." "I have to," Flynn said. He glanced out to the side yard, where Leo was kneeling in the grass with his mother's toy car. "He needs to see me go." The meeting room sat on a high floor of a glass tower where the city seemed, from above, less like a place people actually lived in and more like a drawing of itself. The long table was dark and polished. The board members were arranged along both sides of the table in the discrete hierarchy that real power always arranges itself into without being told. At the head sat Audrey, composed again, though Flynn could see, by the way her hands rested in front of her rather than on her lap, that she was not the same woman who had stood in the liquidation yard. Flynn walked in wearing a clean button-down shirt, plain dark pants, and shoes that were polished but not new. He did not carry a briefcase. He did not sit down till he was invited. He was, as always, unhurried. A senior board member opened with what he clearly thought was graciousness. He spoke about the value of Project Sparrow as part of the company's heritage. He spoke about proper stewardship. He used words like alignment and legacy and responsibility. He proposed, on behalf of the board, a generous acquisition of the car, the recovered data, and the accompanying right to tell the story, at a figure that would, as he put it, change a working man's life. Flynn listened without interruption. He waited until the older man was fully finished. Then he spoke, not loudly, but with the even, carrying weight of a person who did not need to raise his voice to be heard. "I understand what you are offering," he said. "And I understand that this car has commercial value. I do not pretend to know anything about share prices or quarterly reports. But if this is the last thing a father ever finished making for his daughter, then the first thought in this room should not be about how to package that story so that it sells well." The room went still, in the specific way rooms go still when they have not been prepared for the thing that has just been said. He went on. "I am not against a proper exhibit. I am not against the Whitmore name being part of what people see. Heritage is not a dirty word. But if this car is lifted out of the garage, it sat forgotten in only to be turned into a marketing campaign, then the people in this room will be finishing exactly the mistake that Henry Whitmore spent his last years regretting, which is putting the work before the person. I do not think anyone in here wants that to be the legacy." He paused. He did not need to say anything else. The older board member did not have a counter. A younger one looked down at his own folder. Audrey had not moved during any of it. When Flynn finished, she stood up slowly from her chair, and in full view of her board, she did a thing that she had not been taught how to do in any of the leadership seminars of her life. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I owe you an apology. I owe your son a larger one. A week ago I said something at a yard that I had no business saying, and I said it in front of a child. I was wrong. I am sorry." A few heads around the table turned toward her, and she did not look away. She did not look at the room for permission. She looked at Flynn. Flynn nodded. Once. The way he nodded when a problem at his workbench had finally settled in a way he could respect. He did not claim the moment. He did not turn it into victory. He simply accepted it, and by accepting it, made it real. In a quieter conversation later that afternoon, Audrey came to Flynn alone. She did not come as a chief executive. She came in plain clothes, with her hair gathered back, carrying a single folder. She laid out an arrangement that she had sketched herself on a blank page, not on letterhead. The little car would be restored properly and exhibited publicly, rather than locked away in a private collection. The accompanying story would be told as it actually happened, including the part where a father had not finished what he meant to give his daughter and a mechanic had been the one to find it. Flynn would be named, openly, as the man who had recovered and preserved it. A small heritage department would be formed inside Whitmore Dynamics, and Flynn would be invited to advise it, not as a symbol, but as a consultant paid for his actual knowledge. An education fund would be created for the children of working families in technical trades, and it would carry, at Flynn's discretion, the name of his late wife. It was a better arrangement than any price. Flynn did not answer right away. That night, in the garage, Leo sat on the crate by the workbench and placed his mother's old toy car beside the rusted little Sparrow. The two did not match in any way, one small and polished by a child's hand, the other larger and still rough with years. But set side by side, they looked like what they were. Two things made out of love. Two things that had kept going long after the person who first held them had let go. Leo looked up at his father. "I think important things should not get forgotten just because they are old," he said. Flynn did not answer right away. He placed his hand lightly on his son's head. He called Audrey in the morning and said yes. Months later, the little car stood in the center of a modest, clean exhibit space on a side gallery of a new technology museum. It had been cleaned, not scrubbed. Restored, not repainted into dishonesty. The rust that had given it its first life was not fully erased. The scraped place where the logo had been was left visible, a quiet record of the years it had spent hiding. Next to it, a small plaque carried 3 lines. Designed by Henry Whitmore. Recovered and restored by Flynn Mercer. Named back into memory with the help of Leo Mercer. There was no marketing language on the plaque. There was only the plainness of something that had finally been allowed to be true. Louisa Whitmore came to the opening. She was older now, smaller than her daughter, and her hand trembled slightly as she took Audrey's arm. She told her, quietly, that Henry had never known how to say the tender things. That he had spent his evenings at drafting tables because he did not know what else to do with the love he felt. That Project Sparrow had been, in his own clumsy way, the loudest thing he had ever tried to say. Audrey listened without interrupting. For the first time in her adult life, her father's absence did not feel like a verdict against her. It felt like a letter he had been writing in shaky handwriting all along. Flynn did not become someone else. He did not trade his garage for an office. He still woke early, still made breakfast for Leo, still sent estimates to customers with old sedans and older trucks. What changed was smaller and more honest. He was not looked through anymore. He was looked at. Leo came to the exhibit in a new pair of shoes that fit well. He stood in front of the little sparrow for a long time. Then he looked up at his father, who was standing beside Audrey, the three of them close enough that from across the gallery they might have looked like a family who had always known each other. "Do you think it is happy here?" Leo asked. Flynn smiled, the kind of small, whole smile that had been missing from his face for a long time. "Yes," he said. "Because someone finally saw it." They stood there together a little longer, not speaking, watching the light fall across the quiet metal. The little car did not gleam. It did not need to. It had already done the larger thing. It had been made. It had been forgotten. And now, after a very long wait, it had been found.